The sun had dipped low behind the jagged mesa when Owen Carver first spotted the motionless form near his water well. At first glance, he thought it might be a wounded animal, perhaps a deer that had collapsed from thirst or injury. But as he approached with his rifle in hand, each step revealing more in the fading light, Owen realized what he was seeing was not an animal, but a girl young, battered, and barely clinging to life. Her black hair was matted with dried blood, her dress torn and stained, and her skin sun-darkened and smeared with dust was too pale to belong to someone healthy. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps that barely stirred the hot desert air, and when he knelt beside her, Owen felt a weak pulse fluttering beneath the skin of her neck. The wariness that had governed much of his life since settling alone on this unforgiving land clashed with a force he hadn't felt in years: empathy. He should walk away. Let the next man find her and face the consequences. But as her eyes fluttered open for a fleeting moment and met his, something in her gaze, fear, hope, the sheer will to survive took hold of him. Without another thought, Owen slipped his arms beneath her and carried her to his cabin. Inside, he laid her gently on the only bed, the one he hadn't shared with another soul since his wife passed 5 years prior. He lit the oil lamp and gathered what little he had: a flask of whiskey, a bucket of well water, strips of cloth from an old shirt. As he cleaned the gash across her forehead, he saw the truth of what had been done to her. These wounds weren't accidental. They were deliberate, cruel. Someone had hurt this girl with purpose. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words in Apache he didn't understand. He answered in English, not expecting comprehension but offering what comfort he could. "You're safe now," he whispered. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." Still, the fear didn't leave him. He didn't know who she was or who might be looking for her. In this land, helping a native girl could be seen as an act of betrayal from either side. By the time dawn broke, the girl's breathing had grown steadier, and Owen sat at the window, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. That's when he heard it: hoofbeats. Not one or two, but many. A thunder of horses across hard ground. When he peeked outside, what he saw froze his blood. Dozens of riders, Apache warriors, silently encircling his land, methodical, calm, certain. They knew what they were doing. More and more emerged from behind rocks, brush, the dry creek bed. By the time the sun had fully risen, there were at least 60 of them, maybe more. They took positions not for negotiation, but for siege. The girl stirred, groaning softly. He helped her to the window, and when she saw them, her face drained of color. She said a name he couldn't understand, then pointed to the distant ridge and whispered one word in English: "Father." The realization hit Owen like a hammer. She wasn't just any girl. She was someone important. Her presence in his home was the reason this war party had mobilized. Soon, a rider approached and called out in English, accusing Owen of harboring what belonged to them. "Send her out now," the man warned, "and maybe you live to see another day." The girl, who had by then told him her name was Lita, shook her head desperately, tears forming in her eyes. She pointed to her wounds, pulled up the torn fabric of her sleeve to show him the deliberate, ceremonial cuts. She was terrified of returning to whoever had inflicted them. Owen didn't understand the language, but the message in her expression was clear. A second rider soon joined the first, younger and visibly anxious. He called out, not with threat but with anguish. "Sister," he cried. "Are you hurt?" Lita responded in Apache, and Owen could feel the shift in tone. This wasn't just a raid, it was a rescue. The young man introduced himself as Matto, her brother. He listened as Lita gestured toward Owen, explained something urgent. Matto translated her story. She had been taken by slavers, white men, who planned to sell her east. She escaped, ran for days before collapsing outside Owen's fence. Matto explained that they had found and dealt with her captors, but now the chief, her father, wanted her returned. When the chief arrived, his presence was absolute. He dismounted and approached unarmed, a gesture of confidence or trust, or both. Owen stepped out with Lita. Rifle lowered. The chief examined his daughter, then listened as she spoke rapidly. She described how Owen had found her, tended her wounds, gave her his bed. The chief looked at Owen and said, "You asked for nothing. This is not the way of most white men," Owen replied. "It's the way of any decent man." The chief nodded slowly, then declared to his warriors that Owen was under his protection, that any harm to him would be considered harm to the chief's own family. Still, not all the warriors agreed. One, younger and bold, challenged the chief's decision. His name was Kai, and he claimed that mercy toward white men would be seen as weakness. He feared Owen would betray them, lead soldiers to their lands. Lita intervened, speaking to Kai with fire in her voice. Whatever she said moved him. He looked at Owen and said, "Your hands, they are working hands, not soft hands of a thief." He spoke of the photo on Owen's table, the one of his wife, and said that Lita believed Owen understood loss. Then Kai turned to the chief and spoke. They offered Owen a chance not just to leave unharmed, but to join them in a raid against a nearby slave camp. Owen hesitated only a moment. The thought of more women like Lita, caged and tortured, settled the question. He agreed. They rode together toward Snake Creek, where the slavers waited, unaware. At sunset, the warriors attacked. Owen joined the rescue group. He broke locks, lifted captives too weak to walk, and fought side by side with the Apache, his rifle finding targets with grim precision. When it ended, 15 slavers lay dead. 23 captives were freed. The chief approached him afterward. "Turokuyum, you fought like Apache," he said. Kai clasped Owen's shoulder and added, "You are brother now." Lita, her strength returning, thanked him. "For life," she said, "for honor." 3 days later, Owen sat on his porch. The bracelet she left behind lay beside his wife's photograph. He wasn't the same man anymore. He had risked his life for a stranger. He had chosen to act, even when no one would ever know. And now he knew if faced with that choice again, he would do the same. The morning air was unusually still, heavy with a silence that didn't belong. Caleb Mercer stepped outside, coffee cup in hand, expecting to see the usual stretch of dust and sage beyond his porch. Instead, he froze. Riders, dozens of them scattered like ghosts along the distant ridgelines and slopes, silent and unmoving. His eyes narrowed. They were Apache, and they were watching his ranch like predators circling prey. He set his coffee down, stepped back inside, and reached for the Winchester leaning near the door. His cabin, old and weather-beaten, suddenly felt smaller, more fragile than it ever had before. As he peered through a crack in the shutters, the numbers kept growing. First 20, then 50. By the time the sun was fully over the horizon, nearly 100 Apache warriors had positioned themselves in a wide circle around his land, mounted and silent. Their eyes locked on his home like stone sentinels. Inside, the girl stirred. She had slept through the night in his bed, her breathing shallow but steady, her wounds cleaned and wrapped as best as he could manage. She barely spoke, but her eyes dark, alert, and clouded by pain were always watching. She hadn't told him much. Only her name, Mira. He didn't press. Last night, when he found her collapsed near the cattle fence, something in him shifted. She'd been too light in his arms, too broken for someone so young. Now he looked at her. This girl wrapped in a blanket far too big for her frame, and knew that whatever trouble followed her had finally arrived. She saw his tension and asked weakly in English, "They're here, aren't they?" Caleb nodded, gripping his rifle. She tried to rise but winced. "I need to speak to their leader," she whispered. "It's my father. His name is Gray Fox." Caleb turned slowly. Gray Fox. That name wasn't just known, it was feared. A war chief whose name echoed through every saloon and military outpost west of the Pecos. Stories said he could read the wind, silence a crowd with a glance, and lead hundreds with no more than a raised hand. If this girl was truly his daughter, Then Caleb was caught in something far bigger than a simple rescue. Mira struggled to her feet, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulder. Her voice was thin but steady. "You saved me, but you don't understand what that means." Before he could ask what she meant, a single rider approached from the tree line. The others didn't move. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle low but ready. The rider stopped a dozen yards away and dismounted. He was tall, face lined with age and wisdom, hair braided with eagle feathers. He carried no weapon. His presence was enough. Gray Fox stepped forward and locked eyes with Caleb. "You have someone who belongs to my people," he said calmly. But every word carried the weight of thunder. Mira stepped into view behind Caleb, and the chief's expression changed. Relief, anger, worry, all flickered through his eyes before his face returned to calm. She spoke in Apache. The words flowed fast, emotional, and Caleb couldn't follow. But he saw how Gray Fox's shoulders tensed, how his fists clenched at her wounds. She must have told him everything. The chief turned back to Caleb. "Where did you find her?" Caleb gestured toward the south field, near the cattle fence, yesterday evening. She was unconscious, no weapons, no food. Looked like she'd been running for days. Gray Fox nodded slowly. She was taken by slavers. They planned to sell her in Santa Fe. He paused. "Your kind." Caleb flinched at the accusation but didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the world to know the truth in it. "You did not harm her," Gray Fox continued. "You gave her shelter. You treated her wounds. That is rare." Caleb said nothing. What could he say? He'd done what any decent man should do, even if it put him in the crosshairs of 100 mounted warriors. But not everyone among the Apaches was satisfied. A second rider stepped forward, broad-shouldered, scarred, younger than Gray Fox but carrying his own weight of authority. He looked at Caleb with open suspicion. "How do we know this wasn't a trap?" he asked in clipped English. "What if he took her first, and now pretends kindness to save himself?" Mira interrupted, stepping forward with unexpected strength. "No," she said. "He found me. He didn't touch me. He gave me water and kept the fire going all night. He's the reason I'm alive." The man's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Even so, this land was stained by our enemy. Blood was spilled here. That makes it sacred. And sacred ground must be answered with truth." Gray Fox nodded. "He speaks of the old ways." He told Caleb, "When someone touches death, as you have by bringing her inside, they become tied to the fate of the one they saved." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means you have a choice," the chief replied. "You can walk away and we will not follow. Or you can help us finish what was started." Caleb felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. "Finish?" he asked. Gray Fox gestured toward the hills. "The men who took Mira are still out there. They have others, girls, children. We tracked them to a canyon 3 miles north. At dawn tomorrow. We ride. You are not of our blood. But your actions have earned you the right to stand among us." Caleb glanced at Mira, who looked back at him with a mix of hope and apology. He thought of the pain in her eyes, the bruises on her arms, the way she had clung to life with nothing but willpower. "I'll ride," he said. The campfire crackled that night as Caleb sat among the Apache warriors. Silent but included, Mira slept nearby, surrounded by women who had come to reclaim her. Gray Fox spoke little, but occasionally cast glances in Caleb's direction, curious, maybe respectful. The next morning they rode out together, cutting across dry land and rock, the rising sun at their backs. The raid was swift and brutal. Caleb moved with instinct, protecting captives, firing only when necessary. When it was over, they had freed 14 women and 3 young boys. The slavers were gone. Justice, in its roughest form, had been delivered. Back at the ranch, Mira approached him, holding something in her hands. It was a carved medallion on a leather cord, shaped like a hawk mid-flight. "My father says you've earned this," she said. "You're no longer just a man who helped. Your family. Caleb took it silently, motion tightening his throat. Gray Fox stepped forward one last time. You saved what we could not. That is not forgotten. When they rode off, the horizon swallowed them up. Caleb stood alone again, but not unchanged. The porch was the same. The wind still whispered through the cottonwood, but something inside him had shifted. He was no longer just a man surviving the West. He had become part of something larger, an act of mercy that rippled far beyond his fence line. The wind carried a dry whisper across the plains as Colton Hayes stepped out of his cabin, his eyes sweeping over the morning haze that still clung to the earth like a ghost that hadn't yet let go. The firewood pile was low, and the chickens were already pecking at the ground near the corral. Everything about the morning should have felt familiar, predictable even, but there was a weight pressing against his chest, one that had settled there the moment he found her. She lay just beyond his east fence line, half buried in dust, her limbs slack and skin mottled with bruises that told stories no one should ever have to live through. At first, he wasn't even sure she was breathing, but when he reached her side, he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. There was blood, dried and flaked against her temple, and rope burns around her wrists so deep they looked almost burned into the skin. Colton had lifted her with the kind of care one reserves for a wounded animal or a fragile memory. She didn't weigh much, barely more than a sack of grain, and the closer he got to the cabin, the more guilt gnawed at him. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to hurt her, they had wanted to destroy her. He laid her on his cot, wrapped her in a quilt that once belonged to his sister, and sat beside her through the night, trading sleep for the occasional stir of breath that let him know she was still holding on. Her face, though young, held the sharp features of the Apache, and even unconscious, there was something regal about the way her brow furrowed, as if she were holding court in her dreams, fighting demons only she could see. When she finally woke, her eyes darted around the room with the panic of someone who had known too many cages. He didn't ask questions, he offered water, which she took in trembling sips, and a piece of cornbread that went untouched. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but certain. She said her name was Elin. She said nothing else. And Colton didn't press. He knew silence could be a shield, and whatever she was hiding behind it had teeth. But the following day, the silence was broken not by Elin, but by the distant rumble of hooves. He saw them before he heard them clearly. Figures cresting the hills like a tide of shadow and leather. The Apache had come. And they weren't alone. The riders moved with a purpose that didn't belong to scouting parties. There were too many of them, their formation too deliberate. This was no search party. It was a show of power. By the time they reached the outer fence, there were nearly 80 warriors, mounted and armed, surrounding his homestead in a quiet circle of judgment. Elin saw them and didn't react with fear but with resignation. She sat up, pain flickering across her face, and whispered a name Colton didn't recognize at first. Red Crow. The name didn't belong to a place or a memory. It belonged to a man, her father, she said. A leader. Not just among the Apache, but one whose influence stretched beyond tribal boundaries. A man whose word could stir peace or war. She was his daughter. The realization hit Colton like a hammer to the chest. He hadn't just saved a girl. He had intercepted a storm. Red Crow arrived soon after, not at the front of the party, but walking among them, his hair streaked with age and sun, his eyes dark and unreadable. When he dismounted and entered the yard, the warriors held their line, silent and still. Elin stepped out of the cabin to meet him, and for a moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other. Then she spoke, and though her voice was weak, it carried. She told him of her capture, of the 3 weeks she spent in darkness and chains, of the men who traded her like coin. She told him how she escaped, how she ran for miles without food or water, how she collapsed just beyond the fence of a man who could have turned her away but didn't. Red Crow listened, his face unmoved, but his fists clenched tight at his sides. When she finished, he turned to Colton. "You have done something no other has done for my people," he said. You sheltered my daughter without knowing who she was, without fear, without reward. That cannot be ignored. But there was more in his tone, something deeper, darker. Colton had not only saved a life, he had touched something sacred, something political. Elan wasn't just a victim. She was a symbol, a potential rallying cry. Her suffering would not be hidden. It would be carried into negotiations, into tribal councils, into the judgment of settlers and soldiers alike. Word of her escape and survival would not remain private. Not anymore. Red Crow knew it. So did the warriors who stood behind him. Some looked at Colton with respect, others with suspicion, because in saving her, he had inserted himself into a larger narrative, one that carried weight and consequences far beyond his fence line. Elan's trauma would be their fuel. Her rescue would be their signal. And Colton quiet. Solitary Colton was now tied to it all. Later that night, as the Apache camped near his land and Elan slept under her father's protection, Red Crow returned to Colton's porch. He spoke not as a chief, but as a father. He explained that Elan had been taken during a cross-border trade summit, ambushed by traffickers operating under the guise of trappers. Her abduction had already strained peace talks. Her return would shift the balance again, possibly towards conflict. Colton listened without interrupting. He felt the gravity of it settling like dust on his skin. He hadn't sought any of this. He just didn't want to leave a girl to die in the dirt. Red Crow offered him something then, a token carved from bone and wrapped in sinew, a mark of protection, yes, but also of responsibility. You are part of this now, the chief said. What you did cannot be undone, but neither can what they did to her. And men like them do not stop unless someone makes them. Colton took the token, not out of pride, but because he knew the truth in those words. He had seen her wounds, heard her silence, felt the shaking in her bones when she drank water for the first time in days, and he knew, with a kind of painful clarity, that if someone didn't take a stand, it would happen again. He watched as the Apache broke camp the next morning, Elan riding beside her father, upright despite the pain. Her eyes locked on the horizon. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Colton stood at the edge of his porch, the token still warm in his palm, knowing that from this moment forward the lines between his world and hers were forever blurred. The prairie wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke, sweat, and dust, and somewhere within it, a promise quiet, but unshakable. He hadn't just saved a life. He had changed the course of something far greater. The morning sun climbed slowly over the distant ridgeline, casting long shadows across the dry soil around the ranch house. Levi Coulter stood in the doorway, rifle resting loosely in his hands, watching the silent ring of Apache warriors who surrounded his land. It had been hours since they arrived, hooves thudding in waves like distant thunder, each warrior slipping into place with discipline that could only come from years of war. They made no move to attack, but the stillness was tense, like a bowstring drawn and waiting. Inside, the girl rested, bruised and pale, but alive. Her name was Nessa, and though Levi still didn't know everything that had led her to collapse just beyond his fence line, he knew enough. She had been tortured, hunted, and left to die, and now the people she belonged to had come to reclaim her. From the crowd, one rider dismounted. He was older than the others, tall and proud, with a face carved by time and burden. He walked slowly toward the cabin, alone, his hands open, showing no weapon. Levi stepped off the porch but kept his rifle low, a silent message that he was prepared for peace or war. The man introduced himself in a calm, steady voice. His name was Greyhawk, and he was Nessa's father. Not just her father, but the chief of their people. His reputation preceded him, tales of cunning strategy and unbroken resolve, a man who had survived betrayals and battles that had claimed lesser leaders. Now here he stood, only a few feet from the man who had taken his daughter into his home. Nessa emerged from the cabin slowly, her gait unsteady but purposeful. When she saw Greyhawk, her eyes filled with tears. but she stood tall. She spoke in her own tongue, words tumbling quickly, her hands moving to show the scars on her wrists and the bandages Levi had wrapped the night before. Greyhawk listened without interruption, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. When she finished, he looked at Levi, long and hard. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Greyhawk nodded once. "You could have left her," he said in low, measured English. "Many would have. She is not of your people. Yet you carried her, healed her, gave her shelter. For that, I owe you something few men have earned my trust." Levi said nothing. He didn't want praise. He hadn't helped Nessa to be noble or brave. He helped her because she was a person in need, because he couldn't stomach the idea of walking away. Greyhawk raised a hand, and the warriors behind him relaxed, though they did not dismount. He turned to his men and addressed them in Apache, and Levi could feel the weight of the moment. Whatever was being said, it shifted something in the air. It was as if the land itself paused to listen. When the chief finished and he turned back to Levi, "You are under my protection now. No man from my tribe will raise hand or blade against you." But not all present accepted this peace. From the ranks, another man stepped forward, younger than Greyhawk, but taller, with eyes like chipped stone and a voice that cut the quiet like a knife. His name was Bear Runner, a war leader known for his boldness and fire. He did not greet Levi or show deference to Greyhawk's decision. "This man," he said, "is not one of us. He does not share our pain or carry our dead. He lives behind a fence built on stolen land, and we are to protect him now." His words stirred murmurs among the warriors, a ripple of tension that swept through the ranks. Greyhawk raised his hand again, but Bear Runner did not yield easily. "Chief," he continued, "if we are to offer protection, it must be earned. He has done a good deed. Yes, but kindness once does not erase blood spilled across years." Levi stepped forward then slowly, careful not to appear as a threat. "You're right," he said plainly. "I haven't lived your pain, but I've buried my share of the innocent. My wife died 2 winters ago, not from war, but from fever, and I watched her fade, knowing I could do nothing. Since then, I've lived alone, kept my head down, tried not to get involved. But when I saw your daughter lying in the dirt, that didn't matter. She needed help. I gave it. That's all I know how to do." The words hung in the air, raw and without apology. Bear Runner studied him, searching for weakness, but found none. Nessa moved closer to Levi, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. "He saw me as a person," she said, "not as a danger, not as a burden. He saw me." For a moment, Bear Runner's face softened, not with warmth, but with understanding. He turned to Greyhawk and nodded once, then let him prove it. Greyhawk agreed. He proposed something dangerous but necessary. A nearby group of traffickers had been moving stolen people through the desert, a camp of misery hidden in the canyon 2 days' ride west. They had taken more than Nessa. Others still remained, and the tribe planned to strike. Greyhawk offered Levi the choice to ride with them. "This is not your fight," he said, "but it could be your stand." Levi didn't hesitate. "I'll go." They left that night, a dozen riders cutting through the dark, guided by stars and instinct. Nessa stayed behind with the elders, her wounds still too raw. The journey was long, marked by silence and occasional tension. Bear Runner rode near Levi but spoke little. There was no room for small talk in what they were about to do. When they reached the canyon, they moved with precision, each man knowing his place. Levi took a position near the western edge, covering the back entrance. The signal was a hawk's cry, sharp and brief. The assault was swift and brutal. Gunfire cracked through the air. Screams echoed off the canyon walls. When it was done, the captives, women, children, and a few wounded men were freed. The slavers lay broken in the dust. Bear Runner found Levi after the fight. Blood streaked across his chest, one arm cradling a gash in his side. He looked at the rancher, nodded once, and said, "You didn't run?" Levi answered, "Wasn't planning to." Later, back at the camp, Greyhawk approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You chose to stand when you could have hidden. That is the mark of a brother, not a stranger." He presented Levi with a woven band, the color of earth and fire, a sign of trust. Levi took it without a word, but with a heart changed forever. The following days passed quietly. The warriors dispersed. The rescued began their healing. Nessa returned to her people, but before she left, she sat with Levi on the porch one final time. "I won't forget," she said, "not what you did, not who you are." He nodded, tipping his hat. As she rode away, the wind picked up, brushing against the barn, carrying with it something more than dust, a sense that peace, once earned through kindness and sacrifice, could stretch across even the deepest divides. Levi remained seated long after the dust had settled, not alone anymore, not in the way he used to be. Something had shifted, something had begun. The fire crackled low that evening, casting soft flickers of light across the dirt floor and weathered walls of the cabin. Clay Matthews sat in silence beside the embers, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the room. The girl he had rescued, Nessa, slept soundly in the cot, her breathing now steady, her face peaceful despite the faded bruises and bandaged wounds. Outside, the hush of night was broken only by the faint whinny of horses and the distant murmurs of Apache warriors who still stood guard beyond the tree line. Clay had seen more tension in the past 2 days than in all the years since he buried his wife and chose a life of isolation. But now, with her presence, with the stares of those warriors, and with the words of the chief still fresh in his mind, he understood that the time for hiding had passed. Just before sunset, Chief Greyhawk had stepped into the cabin without invitation, yet without malice. He moved like someone who had long carried the weight of leadership, measured, solemn, aware of every gaze upon him. Alongside him came Bear Runner, the war leader whose suspicion of Clay had not fully faded, though something in his eyes had changed since the day of the girl's return. The chief sat across from Clay, resting his weathered hands on his knees, and began to speak. His voice was quiet, but each word landed with weight. He explained that the men who had taken Nessa were not isolated criminals. They were part of a larger ring, moving captives, many of them women and children, across the Western territories, trading lives for gold and silence. The camp where they operated was no more than 30 miles to the north, hidden in the bends of Dry Skull Canyon. Greyhawk paused then, letting the silence sink in. Bear Runner leaned forward. "We will strike them," he said, "tonight, if the wind favors us. But there is risk. The ground is steep. The men are armed. We will need every blade and rifle, even yours." Clay set his coffee tin aside, not surprised by the request. "You want me to fight?" Greyhawk nodded. "No man is required, but those who call themselves honorable must choose. You helped Nessa. That was not small. But the evil that harmed her still breathes, still waits in darkness to take more. If you walk away now, you return to silence. But if you ride with us, your voice speaks through action." Clay looked at his hands, rough and scarred from years of ranching, but steady. For most of his life, he had avoided entanglements. After the war, after the fever took his wife and the crops failed 3 years running, he had no desire for anything but quiet. But something had shifted when he'd lifted Nessa from the dirt. For the first time in years, he had seen his actions ripple outward, changing more than just his own circumstances. He had chosen to help, and now that choice demanded more. "I'll go," he said, his voice low but sure. They rode out 2 hours before midnight, moving swiftly through the dry brush, their horses trained to silence. Clay rode near the rear, watching how the Apache warriors communicated with nods and gestures, their cohesion like that of men bound not just by blood but by purpose. The moon was a thin silver crescent overhead, offering just enough light to trace the ridgelines that guided their path. Bear Runner rode beside him for much of the journey, silent at first, then speaking. "I doubted you," he admitted. You are not of us. Your people have broken promises, burned homes, taken daughters, but Nessa speaks of you with honor. That means something, Clay answered with a simple truth. I'm not here to change the world, just to do what I can with the time I've got left. By the time they reached the canyon rim, the stars had shifted and a faint light had begun to bloom in the east. Below, nestled between rocky outcroppings, the camp sprawled in disorganized clusters tents, wagons, makeshift pens where the captives were kept. Clay's stomach turned at the sight of it. Human suffering had a smell, a shape, a sound you could hear even through distance and silence. The chief whispered orders. The warriors dispersed like smoke, taking positions along the canyon's edge. Clay followed Bear Runner, moving to a low ridge that offered cover and a clean view of the southern gate. When the signal came, a single cry of a night bird chaos followed. Arrows flew first, then gunshots cracked through the cold air. Men shouted, some in English, some in Spanish, some with no words at all. Just fear and violence. Clay moved without hesitation, his rifle rising and falling, each shot deliberate. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't pretend to be but in that moment he was necessary. He broke the lock of one cage with the butt of his weapon, pulled a young boy free from the arms of a dying man, and covered the retreat of two warriors carrying a wounded elder. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and sweat mingled in the air, thick as storm clouds. When the last slaver fell, the camp grew still. Screams gave way to sobs, and sobs to silence. Greyhawk stood in the center of it all, his blade stained, his face unreadable. Bear Runner approached Clay, his side grazed by a bullet but his stride unbroken. You fought like one of us, he said simply. And you didn't run. Clay didn't answer but met his gaze, an understanding passing between them that didn't require words. The survivors were gathered 27 in all, most of them young, all of them scarred. They would return with the Apache to safer lands, begin healing, find their names again. As dawn stretched across the sky in a pale orange ribbon, the warriors prepared to ride back. Greyhawk approached Clay and handed him a piece of woven leather, dyed deep red and black, with a carved stone in the center. This marks you, he said, not as Apache, but as a man who chose to stand when it mattered. Clay took it, turning it over in his hand. I didn't come for this, he said. Greyhawk nodded. That's why you deserve it. They rode back slower, burdened by both loss and relief. The captives rode in silence, some cradled by warriors who had once been strangers. Nessa greeted them at the ranch gate. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw the children, and Clay saw something in her expression that gave him peace, not just survival, but hope. She walked beside him as he dismounted, her voice soft. Thank you for going, she said. You didn't have to. Clay looked toward the horizon where the sky now blazed with morning light. Maybe I did, he replied. Maybe this is who I was supposed to be all along. He hung the woven token by the window that night, beside the photograph of his wife. The house still creaked in the wind. The fields still waited to be tended, and the road remained empty in all directions. But Clay no longer felt alone. He had acted, chosen, become something more than a man hiding from the world. And though the land around him hadn't changed, something inside him had. And he knew it never would again. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that settled deep into the skin and told of storms not yet arrived. Jacob Sloan rode at the rear of the column, flanked by Apache warriors whose faces showed no fear, only focus. They moved like ghosts across the land, their horses trained to avoid loose stones and brittle brush. Each rider knew their role, and each knew what was at stake. This wasn't a raid for territory or revenge. It was a rescue, and Jacob had chosen to be part of it. Since bringing Nessa into his cabin and learning her story, Jacob hadn't slept the same. The bruises on her arms, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she winced even at gentle touch, those things stayed with him. And when Chief Greyhawk asked if he would join them in striking the slaver camp where others like her remained imprisoned, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't courage that made him say yes. It was anger, guilt, and something deeper, a reckoning with the man he used to be and the man he wanted to become. The warriors around him had accepted his presence, though not all trusted him. Bear Runner, the war leader, still watched Jacob with cautious eyes, measuring each move. But Greyhawk's word carried weight, and he had vouched for Jacob with the full authority of his years. The chief rode at the front, his long hair tied back, his bow resting across his back like a symbol of intent. No drums, no war cries, just the quiet hum of horses and the sound of wind pushing through the canyons. They reached the edge of the slaver camp just before dawn. From their vantage point on the cliffs above, Jacob could see the firelight flickering below. Tents were scattered among the boulders, wagons parked in lazy rows, and near the center, a large wooden pen. Even from a distance, Jacob could see the movement inside, women huddled together, some holding children, others staring blankly at the fire as if trying to will themselves somewhere else. Rage rose in his chest like bile. He didn't know their names, didn't know their stories, but he knew enough. They were human beings treated like cargo, and that was more than he could bear. Greyhawk signaled with a raised hand, and the warriors melted into the shadows. Bear Runner pulled Jacob aside and pointed toward the far edge of camp. "You go there," he whispered. "Cover the back. If any run, stop them. No mercy for slavers." Jacob nodded and made his way down the slope, rifle in hand, heart pounding. He crouched behind a boulder and waited, counting his breath, listening to the heartbeat in his ears. The attack began with a single arrow striking the lookout above the main tent. It was followed by a volley that rained down silently but with deadly accuracy. Shouts erupted from the camp. Men scrambled, half-dressed, grabbing pistols and rifles. But the Apache were already inside, moving fast, their blades flashing, their war cries sudden and sharp. Jacob saw one man trying to run toward a wagon. He raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The slaver dropped without a sound. Another tried to flee with a captive girl, dragging her by the wrist. Jacob sprinted forward, tackled the man, and hit him with the butt of his rifle. The girl screamed, but Jacob spoke gently. "You're safe. Run toward the horses. Find Greyhawk." He didn't have time to see if she made it. Gunfire erupted behind him, and he turned to see two slavers aiming from behind crates. He dove behind a barrel as bullets splintered the wood beside him. He returned fire once, then again, hearing a cry of pain after the second shot. The third shot dropped the last man. Jacob breathed hard, sweat pouring down his back, but he kept moving. The pen was now open. Apache warriors were helping captives out, lifting those too weak to walk. Some cried. Others were too stunned to react. Jacob ran to help, pulling down the crossbeam and pushing open the last gate. A woman stumbled forward, her face gaunt, arms cradling a toddler. She looked up at Jacob and whispered, "Please, is this real?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "You're going home." Behind them, the final pockets of resistance were falling. Bear Runner fought like a force of nature, his tomahawk rising and falling with precision. Greyhawk moved calmly through the chaos, directing warriors, protecting the weak, silencing threats. Jacob saw a slaver trying to crawl away, bleeding but still alive. He raised his rifle but stopped. The man turned to him, begging. "I was just doing what I was paid to do." Jacob stared at him a moment, then lowered the rifle. "Then you chose the wrong job." He turned and walked away. By sunrise, it was over. 23 captives were freed. 14 slavers lay dead. And a handful more had fled into the wilderness, unlikely to last long without food or water. The warriors regrouped near a small stream, tending to wounds, binding cuts, and offering water to the rescued. Jacob sat beside a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. His face was bruised, his lips split, but he smiled when Jacob handed him a piece of dried meat. "What's your name?" Jacob asked. The boy replied softly, "Samuel." Jacob nodded. "You're going to be all right, Samuel." Bear Runner approached, blood smeared across his shirt, a cut above his brow. He looked down at Jacob, then sat beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Bear Runner said, "You fought well." Jacob looked at him. "So did you." Bear Runner handed him a strip of leather cord tied with 3 small beads. "Take this from our people. You are not Apache, but you are not the same man you were either." Jacob took the cord without ceremony and slipped it into his pocket. Later, as they rode back through the canyon, the captives placed gently on horses and blankets. Jacob looked back at the smoke rising from the former camp. It was a scar on the land, but also a grave for something darker. Nessa met them at the camp border. She ran forward and embraced Greyhawk, then turned to Jacob. Her eyes shone with tears as she touched his arm. "You came back." He nodded. "We all did." She took his hand and placed something in his palm, a carved stone shaped like a rising sun. "From my mother," she said. "She believed light always finds a way through." Jacob closed his fingers around it, unable to speak. He had never expected to be part of something larger than himself, never thought a rancher with a broken heart could help mend others. But now, surrounded by survivors and warriors who called him brother, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The ride home was slow, careful, but different than the one out. There was laughter now, whispered thanks, the sound of children sleeping against the shoulders of strong arms. Jacob watched it all, then lifted his gaze to the sky. The past was still behind him, but what lay ahead had shifted, and he knew now, without doubt, that he'd never again be content to live quietly while others suffered. Not when he had a voice, not when he had a choice. The morning after the raid, the land still carried the scent of gunpowder and smoke, but the silence that followed was softer than the night before. Sunlight stretched across the canyon walls in golden streaks as the rescued women and children began to stir from their sleep beneath wool blankets and cedar shade. The Apache warriors moved quietly among them, offering water, tending wounds, and helping those too weak to stand. Jacob Sloan stood just outside the makeshift camp, watching it all unfold with a strange mix of weariness and peace. His muscles ached, his shirt was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood clung to his knuckles, but he felt lighter than he had in years. He had not expected to survive the fight, much less to feel welcome among those who, just days before, would have seen him as an outsider or worse. And yet, here he stood, no longer just a rancher who kept to himself, but a man who had fought beside warriors, had defended the helpless, and had kept a promise made with action, not words. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. It was Bear Runner, the war leader who had once looked at him with nothing but suspicion. The man was still intimidating, his presence as commanding as ever, but something in his eyes had shifted. He walked up slowly, his face unreadable, then held out his hand. Jacob took it without hesitation. Their grip was firm, brief, and carried more meaning than any conversation could express. "You fought like a man who had something to lose," Bear Runner said after a moment. Jacob nodded. "I reckon I had a lot more to lose than I realized." The warrior tilted his head slightly, considering the answer. "Many speak of honor," he said. "Few carry it into danger. You did not run, you did not hesitate, and you did not act for glory." He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a braided cord, simple in design but rich in meaning. At its center was a carved piece of red stone, shaped like a rising flame. Bear Runner offered it to Jacob. "This is given only to those we call brothers, not by blood, by choice." Jacob took the bracelet, fingers closing around it with reverence. He didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because no words would have measured up to the moment. Bear Runner gave a single nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Jacob standing there with the wind brushing lightly across his shoulders, and the weight of that small token pressing into his palm like the imprint of trust. Later that day, as the rescued captives were prepared for travel and the camp began to pack up, Nessa found Jacob near the water's edge. She had regained much of her strength, though her gait was still careful, her body not yet fully healed. Her eyes, however, were bright and clear, free from the fog that had once clouded them. She approached him with a soft smile, holding something in her hands wrapped in a strip of buckskin. "I've been waiting for the right moment," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "to thank you properly." Jacob looked at her, his expression kind but serious. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You've already thanked me enough just by making it." She shook her head. "No. You don't understand. When I ran from those men, when I collapsed on your land, I was ready to die. I was empty. But something in me, something I don't have a name for, told me I wasn't finished. It told me someone would find me, and not just anyone, the right person, and that person was you." He lowered his gaze, unsure how to carry such weight. She stepped closer and placed the wrapped object in his hand. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "She wore it every day until the sickness took her. It's a symbol of trust, of guidance, of knowing that even in darkness there's always a light worth following." Jacob opened the cloth to reveal a small pendant, shaped like a teardrop, carved from white bone and polished to a soft shine. He swallowed hard, then gently closed the cloth again and held it to his chest. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. Nessa placed a hand on his arm. "Just don't forget who you are now. You may go back to your ranch, your quiet land and your long days, but you're not the same man anymore. You've been seen. You've been chosen." That night, as the tribe prepared their fires and the captives finally slept without fear, Greyhawk called the warriors and a few select others into a circle. Jacob was among them, seated beside Bear Runner and Nessa. The chief stood in the center, tall and silent, before raising his hands. "We live in a time where trust is rare," he said, "where kindness is mistaken for weakness, and justice often comes too late. But this man," he said, gesturing toward Jacob, "has shown us that there is still strength in doing what is right, even when no one is watching." He stepped forward and placed a second bracelet on Jacob's wrist, this one with the colors of the rising sun and the mountains etched into the leather. "This is not for battle," Greyhawk said. "This is for belonging, wherever you go. Whatever path you choose, know that you have a place among us. You are not a visitor anymore. You are kin." The warriors stood in unison, raising their arms in silent acknowledgement. Jacob looked around, stunned, his chest tight with emotion. He had come to this land for solitude, to bury pain, to escape the world that had taken so much from him. But now he had found something he didn't know. He still needed a family. Not by blood or law, but by bond. As the fire burned down and stars took their place across the sky, Jacob sat alone on the edge of camp, staring at the bracelet on his wrist and the pendant now strung around his neck. The silence felt different now, fuller somehow. No longer a shield, but a companion. He thought of his late wife, of the long nights he had spent speaking to her memory, and he knew she would have understood. He had not sought honor. He had not asked for brotherhood. But both had been given freely, not as reward, but as recognition. And in the quiet of the desert night, surrounded by warriors who once doubted him and a girl whose life had changed his own, Jacob Sloan finally let go of the man he used to be. He had stepped into fire not to prove anything, but because something in him knew it was right. And the man who rose from the ashes would never again walk the same path, not because he was forced to change, but because he had chosen to. And in that choice, he had become more than he ever believed he could be. The wind that swept over the ranch that morning was different, not just in feel but in meaning. The familiar creak of the weathered gate, the soft rustle of dry grass brushing against the fence line, the distant lowing of cattle, everything sounded the same as it had for years. Yet Jacob Sloan could tell that nothing was quite the same anymore. He stood at the edge of his porch, hands resting on the rail, boots caked in dust from the long ride back. The scent of smoke still clung faintly to his coat, a reminder of the raid, of the camp they had torn down, and of the people they had pulled from the jaws of suffering. His fingers found the edge of the leather bracelet now wrapped around his wrist, the one the Apache had given him with quiet ceremony and weighty silence. It felt strange there, not because it didn't belong, but because it did. He had spent years on this land avoiding the world. After losing his wife to sickness and burying too many memories to count, he had settled into a life defined by solitude and repetition. He rose before dawn, mended fences, herded cattle, chopped wood, and spoke mostly to the wind. It had suited him for a time, the silence a balm to a heart too tired for conversation. But then the girl had come, collapsing just beyond his fence line, bloodied and broken. And everything had changed. Jacob had no plans for heroism. He had simply done what needed doing. But the path that opened from that single act of kindness had led him places he never thought he'd go. Into the heart of a tribal family, into the trust of warriors who once looked at him as a threat, and into a fight that wasn't his but became his because he chose to step into it. He had never intended to pick up a rifle again, not after laying it down at the war's end. And yet, when he saw the camp where women and children were being held like cattle, something inside him rose up, unshaken and unafraid. That night, he'd fought not for pride or vengeance, but because something in his soul refused to stay silent anymore. Now, standing on his porch in the morning light, Jacob looked out across the land he had once believed was the end of his story. It had become, unexpectedly, the beginning of another. He could still see the faces of those they had rescued, wide-eyed children, women whose voices trembled with disbelief, elders who wept without shame. He remembered the boy named Samuel, who clung to his sleeve the entire ride back, and the woman who placed her hand on his chest and simply said, "Thank you," before joining her people. He remembered Nessa's words, her quiet certainty that her spirit had trusted the right man. That memory would live inside him for the rest of his days. Inside the cabin, the pendant she had given him, once worn by her mother, now hung beside the window, catching the sunlight and casting a thin, pale glow across the floorboards. Jacob stepped inside and paused, letting his eyes sweep the room. It still held the same plain wooden furniture, the same woven rug worn thin at the center, the same rifle above the mantel. But something about the space felt larger now. Not in size, but in meaning. It had been a shelter for one man's grief. Now, it was a place where healing had begun. His steps were slower as he moved about, not from pain or age, but from reverence. Every detail of his home now reminded him of the journey he had taken, not across the land, but through his own heart. At the hearth, he knelt and stirred the ashes, setting kindling in place for a new fire. The warmth that bloomed from it filled the room with more than heat. It felt like memory, like promise. He glanced toward the corner where Nessa had once lain wrapped in blankets, her breath shallow, her skin pale. Now, he could almost see her there again, not weak, but strong, smiling, safe. The thought brought a tightness to his throat. He stood and turned toward the door, stepping outside again into the crisp air. The horses stood quietly in the corral, and beyond them, the trail they had once followed disappeared into the trees. Jacob imagined the riders out there somewhere, back in their own lands, returning to their own stories. He missed them more than he'd expected. Bear Runner with his sharp eyes and sharper sense of justice. Gray Hawk with his quiet wisdom and heavy presence. Even the silence of their campfires felt like something he'd grown to understand, something that had taught him the value of listening more than speaking. Among them, he had not needed to explain himself. They had judged him not by his past, but by his actions. And in doing so, they had reminded him of who he could still become. He walked toward the barn, pushing open the creaking doors and stepping into the shadowed space that smelled of hay, earth, and time. He touched the beam where he had once leaned in exhaustion, the very day after Nessa had arrived. He remembered her voice echoing softly in the stillness, remembered the way she had looked at him as if he were someone she had known in another life. He smiled faintly. "You were braver than all of us," he whispered, not expecting an answer. He spent the afternoon repairing a section of fence that had needed mending for weeks. His hands moved with quiet purpose, not rushed, not distracted. The sun was high when he finished, and he sat for a long while on a stump overlooking the north field, watching the wind chase through the tall grass. A hawk circled high above, its cry piercing and distant. And for a moment, Jacob imagined it was a sign, or a blessing, or simply the land acknowledging his return. He didn't need the world to remember his name, but he hoped the people he'd helped would remember his choice. When the stars came out that night, he sat on the porch again, wrapped in a worn blanket, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. He held the bracelet in his hand, running his thumb over the stone in its center, and thought of all that had passed. He knew that life would return to routine soon. The animals still needed tending, the land still needed work. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just surviving. He was part of something larger. And that connection, that belonging, gave meaning to every sunrise that would follow. He looked up at the sky, the stars stretching wide and endless above the ranch he had once believed was the last chapter of his life. Now, it felt like the first page of something new. The man who had once hidden from the world was gone. In his place stood someone who had dared to reach beyond the fence line, who had fought beside strangers, who had been called brother and meant it. Jacob Sloan had changed, not through force, not through ambition, but through kindness, sacrifice, and the courage to say yes when it mattered most. And though the land would remember him only in footprints and fence posts, the hearts he had touched would carry his story for generations. This story carries powerful messages about redemption, human connection, and the quiet strength found in compassion. At its heart, it reminds us that it's never too late to change the course of our lives or to impact someone else's for the better. Jacob Sloan was a man marked by grief and solitude, content to live out his days in silence. But when he chose to help a stranger, that single act of kindness opened the door to healing not just for her, but for himself. His journey shows that even the most ordinary person can become part of something extraordinary by simply doing what's right. For older adults who may feel their most meaningful years are behind them, this story affirms that purpose and connection can be found at any age. It encourages us to step beyond our routines, extend a hand, and trust that kindness still matters in this world. We are reminded that character is not shaped by comfort but by how we respond when doing good carries risk. And in choosing to act with courage and humility, we leave behind a legacy far greater than anything written in stone. It lives on in the hearts we've touched.